This is Kelso Surgeon. Thank you very much for joining us for another session of Handicapping 101. Today it's all about the NCAA tournament, especially since I'm releasing my 200-unit NCAA tournament game of the year today. Intend to get the money in a big way in the same package with the 200-unit game. Will be 2 more plays in the NCAA. I'm just looking to have a standout day in the postseason. Also, keep in mind that while our focus is on the NCAA, releasing best bet basketball every single day and winning far more than my share. Once again, the 200-unit NCAA tournament game of the year. Today, you can get it on this site or toll free at 1-800-755-2255, a $50 charge, or you can purchase my March Madness package for just $199 and get that game as part of that package. And remember, tomorrow is my 100-unit NCAA upset game of the year. Now let's talk about today's games. You know, this is an important day for me, and I usually release my 200-unit NCAA game on this day because there are dynamics in play that will help me and will give me an edge, an extra edge in games. So I analyze every single game that was played on Thursday, and of course those teams are playing back today. I want to give you a little insight into what I look for. Listen, and I'm not saying I'm using either one of these games, but I think both of them reflect what you need to look for. You know, I always print out all the box scores and I study them from top to bottom. Now we have in one game today, we have Richmond playing Morehead State. Richmond is a 3-point favorite. Well, now I want to know one thing for certain. In the first game that these teams played, and Richmond was pressed to beat Vanderbilt 69-66 as an underdog. So I know, you know, they have a situation where they could be a little bit tired. So now I go into the box score and I find that Richmond played 8 players during the game. They got 23 points off their bench. That tells me a couple of things. Number one, they do have a bench. I'd like a bench deeper than that. But they went 8 players deep, and when they got down to the 6th, 7th, and 8th player, those guys contributed 23 points. That's a big thing. Now let's get to Morehead State. You know, Morehead State upset Louisville 62-61. And there's no question that they were as straight as a string to do that. So they too come into this off a very draining game, physically and emotionally, because Morehead and Louisville are both from the state of Kentucky and compete against one another on rare occasions. And this had to be a real feather in Morehead's cap that they beat a superior Louisville team, and Louisville certainly has the better talent. So let's look at Morehead. Now keep in mind they're playing a Richmond team that is 8 players deep and got 23 points off his bench. Against Louisville, Morehead played only 7 players. They got 4 points off their bench, and it is really of note that 4 of the starters for Morehead played at least 34 minutes. And you've got to say to yourself, here Richmond had a tough game, but their bench came through for them. They have a little bit of an edge there. Morehead, when you have to rely on 5 players in something such as the NCAA tournament, and you had to play a tremendously difficult game to advance, now you come back, you're going to have to go with those same 5 players again because it's not going to get any easier. So in that game, you look and you'd say, well, Richmond has a little bit of an edge simply on the point of manpower. But once again, you've got to beat the number. It's not who wins. Now, let's just consider also the Gonzaga-BYU game. You know, BYU used 8 players in that 74-66 win over Wofford. 2 players played for 40 minutes the entire game. 2 more for 31 and 35 minutes. The 8 players that they used contributed exactly 10 points to the cause. So you've got a BYU team here that's hidden beneath all the surface is a team that just doesn't have a lot of depth and 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 doesn't have a lot of depth, 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 and doesn't have